जय गुरुदेव। अगाध संशयाम्बोधि समुतरनतारणिं वन्दे विचित्र्यर्थपदां चित्रां तां गुरु भारतीम् सद सद अनुग्रह निग्रह गृहीत मुनि विग्रहो भगवान् सर्वासामुपनिषदां दुर्वासा जयति दैशिकः प्रथमः त्र्यंबका विहित संतति ताम्रपर्णीर सन्मौक्तिक प्रकर कांति विशेष भाजः पूर्वे जयन्ति गुरुवो गुरु शास्त्र सिंधु कल्लोल केली कलनामल कर्णधाराः जयति गुरुरेक एव श्री श्रीकण्ठो भुवि प्रथितः तत्परमूर्तिर्भगवान् महेश्वरो भूतिराजश्च श्रीसोमानन्दबोध श्रीमत् उत्पल विनिहसिताः जयन्ति संविदा आमोद संदर्भा दिक् प्रसर्पिणः तद आस्वाद भरावेश ब्रह्महितामति षट्पदीं गुरुर्लक्ष्मण गुप्तस्य नाद सम्मोहिनीं नुमः सद अभिनवगुप्तं यत्पुराणं च प्रसीदमता हृदयं तत्परो उल्लासयः स्वयम् अस्फुर्य अनुत्तरम् अभिनवरूपा शक्तिः तद्गुप्तो यो महेश्वरो देवः तदुभययामलरूपम् अभिनवगुप्तं शिवं वन्दे यः पूर्णानन्दविश्रान्त सर्वशास्त्रार्थपारगः श्रीक्षेमराजः सो दृश्यादृष्टं मे गुरुरुतमः श्री वसुगुप्त महागुरु सोमानंद प्रभु उत्पल आचार्यन् अभिनव गुप्तं नाथं वन्दे श्री क्षेमराजश्च नमो निखिल मालिन्य विलास पनपटियसे महामहेश्वराय श्री रामाय गुरुरमूर्तये नमः कारुण्यदेहाय वीराय शुभदन्तिने भक्तिगम्याय भक्तानां दुःखहर्त्रे ते नमस्तुते ते यस् उन्मेषनिमेषाभ्यां जगतः प्रलयोदयोः तं शक्तिचक्रविभं प्रभवं शङ्करमस्तुमः नमः शिवाय सततं पञ्चकृत्यविधायिने चिदानन्दघन स्वात्म परमार्थ अवभासिन आस्यानं चित्रस्योगं साकारत्वमुपागतं जगद्रूपतया वन्दे प्रत्यक्षं भैरवं वपुः ॐ आनन्दसुन्दर पुरन्दरमुक्तमाल्यं मौलोहटेन निहितं महिषासुरस्य पादाम्बुजं भवतु मे विजयाय मज्जु मज्जिर्सिञ्चित् मनोहरम् अम्बिकाया सहशीर्षा पुरुषपुनातु वः सहश्चक्षुर्भगवान् सहस्रपाता गले अङ्गी घ्रीणमूले नयने च निश्चला त्रयो अपायामि यमपुरुषा उपासते ॐ सन्नो मित्रः सन्वरुणः सन्नो भवते अर्यमा सन्नो इन्द्रो बृहस्पतिः सन्नो विष्णुरुक्रमः नमो ब्रह्मणे नमस्ते वायु त्वमेव प्रत्यक्षं ब्रह्म असि त्वमेव प्रत्यक्षं ब्रह्म वदिष्यामि रीतं वदिष्यामि सत्यं वदिष्यामि तन्मा अवतु तत्त्वाकारम् अवतु अवतु माम् अवतु वक्तारम् ॐ शान्तिः 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 जय गुरुदेव हर हर महादेव हर हर महादेव Now I will continue with this dedicated, studies, memorial studies in the memory of our Gurudev. And in last week we have just started this, and we are in the preface phase. So let's get into the preface by remembering Gurudev and bowing down in his lotus feet, bowing down in the lotus feet of Guru Parampara. So now Upanishadic interiorization with the Upanishads. With the Upanishads, Indian thought undergoes a profound internal revolution. It was really profound internal revolution. The locus of the sacred power shift from the external altar to the internal self. That happened during the Upanishadic period. Before Upanishadic period, earlier, ritual maintained the cosmic order. Earlier, the priest, the pujari, mediated divine human relationship like an interface. But now, in the Upanishadic period, knowledge becomes salvific. Self-recognition becomes liberation. And this is a civilizational pivot. I'm just picking up some Mahavakyas from Chandogya Upanishad, Tattvam Asi. Tattvam Asi, that ultimate reality thou art. This statement, it's not ordinary statements. That's why we are calling it Mahavakya. This statement collapses the subject-object divide. And the ultimate, the Tat, the ultimate, is not elsewhere. It is identical with the innermost self. And it is an important philosophical shift. Divinity is not externalized, it is ontologized. So the Upanishad internalizes transcendence. Second Mahavakya, for example, Aham Brahmasmi from Brihad Aranyak Upanishad 1.4.10. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, it means. This is also not a mystical poetry, it is ontological declaration which explains self, the Atman, is not a created entity. It is identical with the ultimate ground of reality. And this is the birth of Advait. This is the birth of non dualism. This is the birth of non pluralism, but the ontological identity. So, how this shift is happening here? Preface is signaling from ritual to knowledge. So, earlier paradigm, yagya, that indicates that relate to the cosmic efficacy. But in Upanishadic paradigm, the gyan that is taking us to the liberation. So this is an important shift. Now sacrifice becomes internalized. For example, now we are talking about the Gyan Agni Hotra. So knowledge replaces the ritual mediation. So the Upanishads radicalize religion by shifting authority from priestly performance to ontological insights. So here we can see the ontological non-duality, the Advait ontology. So Upanishadic non-dual means there is no two ultimate reality, no independent world or soul or God. There is one ground, that is the declaration. And later Vedanta formalizes this. But at this stage, it is ex- experiment, experiment, experimental and intuitive only. But this provides metaphysical foundation for the latter systems, including our Shaivism. So the tension within non-duality, Upanishadic non-duality raises a problem. What was the problem? Problem is, if everything is Brahman, then how do we explain the multiplicity? And this becomes the central metaphysical puzzle, and latter system will respond differently. Advaita is responding through Maya theory, Sankhya is responding through dualism theory, and the Buddhism is responding to this puzzle through momentariness and the emptiness theory, and our Shaivism is responding through the dynamic manifestation of consciousness doctrine. So this is a crucial transition period. It's a crucial transition, and it is indicating towards a breeze to Kashmir Shaivism. So Kashmir Shaivism inherits Upanishadic non-duality, but transform it. Instead of static Brahman, Shaivism proposes dynamic Shiva. Instead of illusionary world, Maya, Shaivism says world is real manifestation of Shakti. Instead of negation, Shaivism is saying affirmation, recognition, prativigya. So we can conclude Upanishadic internalization is taking us towards the tantric expansion. So, in a nutshell, the Upanishads internalized the altar into the self, and Kashmir Shaivism universalizes this insight, not merely asserting identity with the absolute, but explaining how absolute freely manifests as the entire universe. Now, we will go deeper. Here, just preface is taking us towards a Rigvedic inclusivity. So, this well known Rigvedic verse, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, Rigved 1.164.46. This verse, very famous verse, often quoted casually. However, in the context of Guruji's preface, it acquires deep historiographical significance. We must read it not romantically but philosophically. The verse Ekam sad vipra bahuda vadanti agnim yamam matriswana ahu. This is the verse. So, what this verse is saying, the real, the Sat is one, and the sages, the Vipras, sages, Brahmans, they speak of it in many ways, sometimes calling it Agni or calling it Yam or with any other names. So, the important point to note here, this verse does not say all religion equal. It says the underlying reality is one and name varies. So, this distinction is crucial. Ontological unity versus conceptual diversity is coming in. So, the Sat means the being, the reality, and a Bahuda Vadanti means expressed diversely. So, this establishes ontological monism and but the epistemological plurality. So, reality is singular, but expression is multiple. This structure becomes foundational for the latter Indian philosophy. If we check the hermeneutical elasticity, now, now we are going to connect it to the civilizational development. So this verse provides theological flexibility. It allows multiple deities, it allows multiple rituals, it allows multiple metaphysical interpretations without collapsing unity. This is the seed of the Indian inclusiveness. That is the real idea of that's why Indian inclusiveness, that embracing every thoughts. Historical significance here need to discuss about this elasticity. Explains this elasticity explains why Sraman ideas could be absorbed, why tantric ritual could coexist with Vedic rituals, why devotion and metaphysics could coexist. So the Indian civilization does not eliminate contradiction, it reframes it under unity. One thing very important here, one warning, light warning or caution you can say, like against the modern misreading of this verse. So this verse is not a modern pluralist manifesto. It is a theological statement about multiplicity of the divine manifestations. And we must avoid projecting contemporary interfaith liberalism backward. Instead, see it as metaphysical inclusivity. Now, the breeze to Kasmir Shavism. From here, Kasmir Shavism operates under this same structure. One ultimate consciousness, Shiva, manifesting as multiple deities, multiple practices, multiple skills, and multiple experiential states. So the Trika system formalizes this in metaphysics. Unity, Shiva, and multiplicity, Shakti, and non-dual integration, that's Advaita. Thus, this Rig Vedic insight becomes philosophically refined in Shaivism, that we can say. So, what begins in the Rig Veda as a poetic affirmation of ontological unity becomes, in Kasmir Shaivism, a fully articulated metaphysical doctrine of unity in diversity, where multiplicity is not illusion but expression. That's the beauty of this development. Let's talk about some Buddhist influence, Buddhist engagements. So, at this stage of Indian intellectual history, Buddhism represents the most sophisticated philosophical challenge to emerging Saiva metaphysics. Kashmir Saivism does not ignore Buddhism. It absorbs, criticizes, and transforms it. This engagement is central to its development also. So let's start with the Vijnanavad, consciousness only, Yogachar. So Vijnanavad asserts external objects do not exist independently. Only consciousness, Vijnana, truly exists. So the important idea here, perceived object is equal to construction within cognition. This is epistemological idealism, which can explain the world is not denied, but it is internalized. This deeply, this deeply influences later Saiva thought. So there is an influence of Vijnanavada. Then the second one is Chanikvada, momentariness, doctrine of momentariness. So it is another Buddhist doctrine. All phenomena are momentary, Chanik. Nothing persists. No enduring self. It's Anatmavad. And the implication is coming. Reality is a stream of discontinuous events. So there is no permanent substratum. And this is radically anti-substratumist. Now the epistemological precision, I'm naming like some great Buddhist logicians like Dhamkriti or Dignaga, developed rigorous theories of perception, pratyaksha, or inference, anumana, or apoha, exclusion theory of meaning. So Indian philosophy becomes analytically sharp, and Savagism cannot remain vague, mystical poetry. It must respond philosophically. So that was impact on Savagism. So the Saiva response, how Saiva responded. Kashmir Saivism agrees with Buddhist that consciousness is primary. That's the agreement. But it disagrees that consciousness is momentary or selfless. Saivism proposes self-illuminous, continuous, reflexive consciousness. Not Vijnana stream, but Chit, pure awareness, instead of momentary flashes. But Saivism proposes a spanda, dynamic pulsation within continuity. So the key philosophical differences here: Buddhism, no enduring self; Kashmir Saivism, self as universal consciousness; Buddhism, momentariness; Saivism, dynamic continuity; Buddhism, emptiness, sunya; Saivism, fullness, purnta; Buddhism, anatma; Saivism, paramatmana. So Saivism absorbs Buddhism's interiority but rejects ontological negation. And the Prativigya and Buddhist critic, that's very important here. Utpal Dev and Avinav Gupta directly engage Buddhist thought. They argue recognition, prativigya, proves continuity of consciousness. If cognition were purely momentary, recognition would be impossible. Therefore, momentariness fails to explain memory and identity. This is a powerful philosophical move. So, what are the philosophical significance of this engagement? The preface subtly signals this when it notes Kashmir Shaivism cannot be conceived without Buddhist influence. This is not dependency, this it is dialectic refinement. Buddhism sharpened the question and Shaivism expanded the answer. So the Buddhist epistemology compelled Kashmir Shaivism to articulate a non-dualism that was not merely metaphysical assertion, but philosophically defensible. The Shaivism emerges as a consciousness affirming response to the Buddhist analytical rigor. That's the beauty. That's the beauty. Let's let's come in the next slide about the how preface is indicating to us the historical facts of Shaivism linked with the Indus Valley considerations. So, at this stage, we enter the most debatable question in the Saiva historiography. And the question is, can Shaivism be traced back to the Indus Valley civilization? Guruji approaches this carefully, neither dismissive or dogmatic. First point, Pasupati seal, discovered at Mohenjo-daro site. And the features on the seal we can have seated horn figure, yogic posture, possibly Murabandha asana like sort of thing, are surrounded by the yogis, surrounded by the animals. Sir John Marshall suggested, he said, this represents an early form of Shiva as Pasupati, lord of animal. Why latter Shiva is called Pasupati, lord of creature, and associated with the yogic posture, esoteric symbolism, and animal mastery. Archaeological hypothesis, if we think of, then Marshall argued Savagism may date back to the Catholic period. This would imply Savagism predate Vedic textual tradition, and this hypothesis is powerful, so powerful but controversial. So the problem, if we talk about here, no deciphered script available, no textual confirmation is there, symbolic ambiguity we can have, and no continuity proof. This figure, Pasupati seal, could be Proto Shiva, could be any fertility deity or a tribal god, or completely unrelated entirely. So we must avoid retrospective projection. Archaeology suggests symbolic continuity, but it cannot prove doctrinal continuity. So this distinction is essential here. Proto-Shiva imaginary, even if it is not doctrinal Shaivism, what may exist? The symbolic archetypes, possible continuities, esoteric posture, animal symbolism, horn divinity, and yogic centrality. But systematized Shaivism emerges much later. But it has some philosophical significance. how Guruji is connecting this here in the preface. Guruji does not claim Indus Valley have full Shaivism. He suggests prehistoric elements may have been incorporated into Vedic religion. Thus, Shaivism is not abrupt, it is culminative. Indus Valley, then Vedic period, then Upanishadic, then Tantric crystallization is happening. So it's like a culminative. So to assert that Shaivism began in the Indus Valley is premature. To deny any continuity is equally simplistic. The responsible position is one of cautious openness. This shows intellectual rigor, and it has breeze to the latter development. Even if symbolic roots are ancient, and doctrinal Shaivism emerges in Agamas, Tantras, and Kasmir philosophical schools. Thus, metaphysical antiguity is not equal to philosophical articulation, and Kashmir Shaivism is a highly refined metaphysical system, not prehistoric cult. In a nutshell, whether or not the Pasupati seal represents Shiva in a strict doctrinal sense, it symbolically reminds us that Shaivism may drawn from civilizational depth far older than its textual articulation. Now, in the next slide, we will go more deeper from cult to metaphysics. So, this slide marks the transformation of Shaivism from a religious current into a philosophical articulated system. So, religions rarely begin as metaphysics in the history of world religion. They usually begins as symbols, rituals, archetypes, cultic practices, and Shaivism is also not an exception. So pretextual Shaivism, if I talk before textual canonization, Shaivism likely existed as localized cultic worship, ascetic traditions, Rudra related devotion, and the yogic practices. If I connect Vedic connections, if we found like Rudra in Rig Veda, Sivo Naha Sumana Bhava. So Rudra gradually assimilated into Shiva. So Rudra is ambivalent here, destructive as well as healing, both the powers. So over the time, Rudra is become Shiva, auspicious transformation. Thus, the early Shaivism is symbolic, not yet systematic. It is mythic, devotional, esoteric, but not fully philosophical. Now, the integration into the Vedic framework, that is the critical development. Shaivism is not rejected by Vedic orthodoxy. It is gradually integrated. Mechanism of integration: first, Puranic narrative assimilation; second, ritual codification; third, incorporation into temple culture; and fourth, philosophical reinterpretation. So Shaivism becomes compatible with Varnashram system, Vedic ritual hierarchy, and the Smarta tradition. This is historical genius of Indian civilization, absorption rather than exclusion. Absorbing other thoughts, embracing other thoughts, inclusivity. So the doctrinal systemization now comes intellectual crystallization. Shaivism develops canonical texts like agamas, philosophical treatises, and metaphysical categories. It happens largely between 4th to 10th century. Here, Shaivism transitions from cultic worship to the systematic ontology. Now, concepts appear such as Shiva as a Shiva as a Param Shakti as a dynamic power, and the Mal theory, Aspanda doctrine, Prativigya philosophies, so many. So this is no longer devotional cult now, it is a rigorous metaphysics. So from the ritual symbolism to ontology, that is the development. This is the core philosophical insight. Earlier Shiva is the deity of destruction, lord of animals, esoteric god. Now, in latter phase, Shiva is the absolute consciousness, ontological ground, dynamic non-dual reality, and the rituals element now reinterpreted metaphysically. For example, Pancha Kritya, fivefold act, Srishti, Sthiti, Sanghar, Tirodhan, Anugrah. These becomes ontological principles, not merely mythical narratives. Now we need to understand why this matters for Kashmir Saivism. Kashmir Saivism represents the most refined doctrinal articulation of Saiva metaphysics. It does not invent Saivism, it systematizes it. Utpal Deva, Avinav Gupta, Chemaraja in our Guru Parampara provide logical defense, epistemological grounding, metaphysical coherence, and Saivism reaches philosophical summit here in Kashmir. The civilizational pattern, this pattern repeats across Indian tradition, from cult to ritual to myth to philosophy to systemization. This is the pattern. So Saivism is exemplary case of this evolution, and Guruji's preface subtly traces this arc. So, in nutshell, Saivism did not begin as a metaphysical doctrine. It became one, and in Kashmir, this transformation reaches its most sophisticated expression, where myth, ritual, and philosophy converge into a unified, non dual ontology. So, for today, that much we are doing. Jai Gurudev. Now I'm going with the Bhairav Astava of Mahamaheswaracharya Abhinav Gupta to close this class today. अतः भैरवस्तवः व्याप्त चराचर भाव विशेषम छिन्मयमेकमनन्तमनादिं भैरवनाथमनाथ शरण्यं त्वन्मयचित्ततया हृदयबन्धे त्वन्मयमेतदशेषमिदानीं भाति मम त्वमनुग्रहशक्त्या त्वं च महेश सदैव ममात्मा स्वात्मयं मम तेन समस्तम् स्वात्मनि विश्वगते त्वयि नाथे तेन न संसृतिभीतिकथास्ति सतस्वपि दुर्धर दुःख विमोह त्रास विद्याय सुकर्म गणेषु अन्तक मां प्रतिमादृश्यमेन क्रोध कराल तमा विनिधिः शंकर सेवन चिंतन धीरो भीषण भैरव शक्तिमयोऽस्मि इतस्मुपोधव भवमय संवि धितारित भूरित मिश्र मृत्युयमान्तक कर्म पिशाचर नाथ नमस्तु न जातु विभेमि प्रोदित सत्य विबोध मरीचि प्रोष्ठित विश्व पदार्थ सतत्व भाव परामृत निर्भर पूर्णे तय हमात्मनि निर्मिति में मानस गोचर में यदैव क्लेश दशातनुताप विधात्री नाथ तदैव मम त्वयि भेद स्तोत्र परामृत वृष्टि रुदेति शंकर सत्यमिदं व्रतदान स्नान तपो भवताप विदारी तापक शास्त्र परामृत चिंता यस्यन्ति चेसी निर्मिति धारा नृत्यति गायति हृष्यति गाढं संविधियं मम भैरवनाथ त्वां प्रियमाप्य सुदर्शनमेकं दुर्लभमन्यजनैः समख्यम् वसुरूपसे कृष्णदशाम्याम् अभिनवगुप्तः अस्तभं करोत् येन विबुधभवमरुसन्तापं शमयति झटयति जनस्य दयालुः इति भारतोत्तम। जय गुरुदेव। हर हर महादेव। जय गुरुदेव। I am closing this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.